Smaller than expected turnout at today's pro-democracy rally. Japanese journalist Kenji Goto executed. And a new political force emerging in Spain.
Good evening. The Civil Human Rights Front says 13,000 people took part in its pro-democracy rally today. Activists say it's aimed at continuing the fight for what they call genuine universal suffrage. Police say 6,600 people were at the starting point at Victoria Park. Ronnie Samtani reports.
It was the first large-scale pro-democracy rally since the end of the Occupy protests late last year. A sea of yellow umbrellas flooded Victoria Park this afternoon as demonstrators gathered at the starting point of the rally. Fighting for what they called genuine universal suffrage, rally organizer the Civil Human Rights Front pointed out that this was a continuation of the civil disobedience movement. Members of student groups who took part in the Occupy campaign were among those who attended today's march.
This is one of the ways to show that the movement will be ongoing, but we will not be defeated.
It's important to have a big turnout today to show that the democracy movement is still strong.
Many took aim at the government.
Obviously, they are not listening to us. I do not encourage any radical actions taking place in Hong Kong, like, for example, damaging any of the buildings or burning cars. But at the same time, we have to say something. We have to come out. We have to do something about it.
Organizers had expected up to 50,000 people to turn up.
Believe that although the citizens may not as much as the 1st of July demonstration, but the ideas and the noise of fighting for true democracy, reject pseudo-democracy's ideas are really clear in the public.
Police officers were deployed along the protest route to prevent any trouble. In addition, members of the Independent Police Complaints Council were there to monitor the situation. The IPCC said things were generally smooth. Officers closed off 3 lanes of traffic during the rally. Organizers met police's requirement to hire 100 marshals to guide the protesters and maintain order as they marched to Central. Protesters began reaching Chater Road at 4 p.m. where they held a sit-in. Several pro-democracy activists made speeches and chanted slogans demanding genuine democracy. Now, responding to the rally, the government pointed out that the second round of political reform consultation is now underway. A spokesman called on the public to adopt a rational and pragmatic approach to try to reach a consensus so as to achieve universal suffrage in the 2017 chief executive election. Ronnie Santani, TVB News.
Staying with political reform, there's been a lukewarm response among pan-democratic lawmakers so far to a proposal by Civic Party lawmaker Ronnie Tong. He suggested scrapping functional constituencies in LegCo in 2020 in exchange for pan-Democrat support for the government's upcoming reform package. Lejeune has that story.
Pan-Democratic lawmaker Charles Mok told TVB News yesterday morning that he would consider Tong's proposal. But he has since made a U-turn, insisting that he would stick to his promise to veto the government's reform plan. Another Pan-Democrat, Joseph Lee, thus believed Tong's proposal is worth considering. Speaking to TVB News today, the Civic Party legislator called on fellow lawmakers to back his plan.
I think the Pan-Democrats will have to wake up that the only way forward is to negotiate and to make proper use of the veto power that we have in LegCo.
Tong added that there's been a lack of political wisdom among pan-democratic lawmakers over the past few years. He also lamented the loss of moderate voices in LegCo. With their boycott of the second stage of public consultation in full swing, Tong hopes public opinion would force them back to the negotiating table.
I think it is silly in politics to say that you will never trust your opponent. If you do not trust Beijing and Beijing does not trust Hong Kong people, then I believe that one country, two systems would entirely collapse.
Executive Council convener Lam Woon Kwang sees obstacles in Beijing agreeing to scrap functional constituencies in 2020. That's because the National People's Congress Setting Committee stated clearly back in 2007 that a 5-step reform process should be launched before that would happen.
I do appeal for the legislators in particular to consider this fact that if you don't move in 2017 on the CE's election, then you can't move in the election for LegCo in 2020.
Liz Jin, TVB News.
The Islamic State militant group says it has executed Japanese journalist Kenji Goto. The news has sent Japan into shock and mourning and sparked condemnation from around the world. James Aiken reports.
The mother of Japanese journalist Kenji Goto says she can't find the words to express her grief. After receiving the news that militants had beheaded her son, Junko Ishido told reporters she can only express her grief with tears. An online video circulated by militant sympathizers purports to show an Islamic State militant beheading Goto. Japan's foreign minister says the government is still analyzing the footage, but adds that it appears authentic. Elsewhere in the Japanese capital, a vigil mixed with a protest was held to pay respects to the 47-year-old father of two. To get rid of terrorism, we have to eradicate every single thing that gives birth to it, including wars, says this woman. After an emergency cabinet meeting, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe called the killings a heinous act of terrorism. The killings of Goto and another Japanese hostage earlier have now prompted tighter security at airports and at Japanese facilities overseas. But Abe says Japan will not give in to terrorism and will continue to provide humanitarian aid to countries fighting Islamic State. The video has heightened fears for the life of a Jordanian fighter pilot also held hostage. He was not mentioned in the video. Efforts to win the release of both hostages had focused on a possible swap for an Iraqi would-be suicide bomber jailed in Jordan. Jordan and Japan had reportedly held indirect negotiations with the militants through Iraqi tribal leaders, but Japan's deputy foreign minister had reported a deadlock in those efforts. Jordan had demanded but never got proof the pilot was still alive. His relatives say they are shocked at Goto's execution and have not received any updates on their family member in days. They've demanded more openness from their government about negotiations for his release as they continue to hold out hope he is still alive and will come home. James Aiken, TVB News.
Meanwhile, Islamic State militants say their retreat from the Syrian border town of Kobani is only a precaution. The claim was made in a video uploaded to social media. A masked man in the video says airstrikes by the U.S.-led coalition were the main reason why Islamic State fighters were forced to withdraw, but he vowed they would attack the town again. The video has since been deleted from the site where it was originally posted. Kurdish forces say they have taken full control of Kobani. The Pentagon says the militants have been driven out of 90% of the town. Kobani has been under siege by Islamic State for several months. The failure to capture Kobani is a major blow to the extremists who once held nearly half the town.
In Spain, about 100,000 people marched through the streets of Madrid yesterday to show their support for a new radical leftist party called Podemos. It's a new anti-austerity group that hopes to emulate the success of Greece's Syriza party in upcoming elections. Podemos supporters from across Spain crammed into central Madrid and packed every nook and cranny, leading to Puerta del Sol Square in a massive march for change. Using the catchphrase, "We can," Pablo Iglesias, the 36-year-old ponytailed leader of Podemos, urged supporters to fight to end Spain's austerity.
Hoy soñamos un país mejor.
He called their movement a wind of democratic change blowing across Europe. He went on to say that if Greek leftist leader Alexis Tsipras could work to end his country's austerity and suffering, so too could Spain. His message obviously resonated among the electorate. Podemos has successfully tapped into Spaniards' austerity fatigue and anger at the country's business and political elite. Formed just a year ago, the party produced a major shock by winning 5 seats in elections for the European Parliament last May. Opinion polls now suggest the party could possibly take the #1 spot in upcoming elections. Experts say if that happens, it would trigger one of the biggest political shakeups in Spain since democracy was restored in 1978 after decades of dictatorship. Even though Spain is emerging from a 7-year economic slump, Podemos insists 1 in 4 people are still out of a job. But Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy hit back, saying he does not agree with the bleak picture painted by the group. Like Syriza in Greece, Podemos hopes to seize power by overturning the two-party system. It also hopes to stamp out other leftist parties, which Podemos insists are doing nothing to rectify recession-weary Spain. And speaking of Greece, its new leader has softened his rhetoric in a dispute with international creditors over bailout. Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras insists he never intended to act unilaterally. He's also pledged to pay back his country's debt to the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Meanwhile, 5,000 people rallied in Athens yesterday against fascism and Nazism. This followed a third-place finish by the Golden Dawn Party in general elections held recently. Members of the far-right party staged their own rally. Police separated the two sides, and both protests ended peacefully.
Still to come tonight in our broadcast, deadly fire rips through Bangladesh plastics factory. Stalemate in a battle of Premiership heavyweights. And a triumphant end to a record-breaking balloon journey.
Here are this year's Best Picture nominees. From the heavy and eccentric to the epic and wonderful, all are deserving of the ultimate recognition. But only one will take home the Oscar. Celebrating the next movie gods and goddesses, Hui Optical celebrates the Oscars on Pearl.
Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison. Nice to meet you again.
When you travel well, you focus on what really matters. Cathay Pacific. Life well traveled.
The voluntary health insurance scheme has much to do with you.
大病過之後，先知道醫保重要。
如果可以包埋以前嘅病症就好啦。
入院前知道要使幾多錢，先至有預算。
The government is proposing a voluntary health insurance scheme with a set of minimum requirements, including coverage of pre-existing conditions, guaranteed renewal, and upfront payment certainty. A public consultation is underway. We welcome your views.
Wednesday.
I never killed anybody. Appreciate it if you just try to believe that. In the next few days, the state of Texas is going to execute an innocent man. What are we going to do about all this?
Let the games begin.
BMWI presents The Mentalist, Season 6 at 10:40 on Pearl. The time now is 7:44. The time check was brought to you by Seiko.
Welcome back. At least 13 people were killed in Bangladesh when a fire swept through a plastics factory in the capital of Dhaka last night. About 70 workers were inside the 5-story factory when the fire broke